My name is Chris Morris, and today I'm going to be sharing my story, which is really about my lifelong journey with depression and suicidality and how I ended up finding some stability eventually through that process. The first suicidal moment that I had, I was 15. Some things had happened with my family. My mom ended up in the hospital, nearly died, and it just stirred this thing in me of what is the point of life? I guess I should back up and say I was not raised in a religious home at all. So I prayed this prayer that I recommend no one ever prays. God, I don't even know if you're real. I don't know if you're interested in me, but I'm going to give you 7 days and then I'm going to kill myself. The countdown was on, and I didn't have any expectation that anything was going to happen. And then on day 6 of that 7-day plan, a really weird thing happened. My next door neighbor, who is my age, who I'd never met before, came over to my house and said, "Hey, I'd like you to go to my birthday party. I think it'd be fun to get a chance to meet you, give you a chance to meet some of my friends. You know, it would be fun." I'm like, I don't have a present for you. She's like, "It's okay, you don't need to have a present." She sort of leans around the door, says, I don't think that Link and Zelda will miss you. We sort of went back and forth a little bit, and I got to the point where I wanted to either shut the door in her face or go to the party just so she would stop. I decided to be nice, and I went to this party. I was absolutely overcome with how kind and how generous and how nice everyone was to me. I remember at one point asking someone, "Why are you being nice to me? I'm kind of I know this about myself. Why are you being kind?" And she said something like, "Well, it's because of Jesus." And normally I'd be like, "Oh, right, okay." But I had in my mind the ticking clock of, well, this is day 6 of this plan that I had with God, or this bet that I had with God. I said, okay, so what does that mean? Well, why don't you come to church and find out? I did something that I never would have expected I would do, and I went to church the next day, and the youth pastor happened to be talking on Romans chapter 8, where there's this verse where it says that if God is for you, who can be against you? He talked about there's nothing that can separate you from the love of God, not life or death or principalities or demons or anything. And then he said, but it's only true for you when you become a Christian. So I went and I talked to him. I'm like, so I don't even know what that means. What does that phrase mean? So he sort of walked me through what it looks like to become a Christian. And I was so enamored by the idea of having God on my team, because my life sort of sucked. Again, I had this idea in my head that, well, this is day 7. And I said, God, if you're real, you need to show up. Not by coincidence. You know, it was on this last day that I had this remarkable presentation of the love of God being for me. So I made a radical shift in my life. The thing that was cool about making that decision is that for a season, my depression and my suicidality sort of, they dissipated, and then the wheels fell off of my life. I woke up just like I did on any other given, it was like a Wednesday or whatever, and went to go say hi, say good morning to my mom. When I knocked on her door and she wasn't awake, which was unusual, I opened the door and she was in the middle of having a seizure. I'm like, "Mom, are you okay?" She kind of lifted out of the seizure for a moment, said, "Yeah, I'm fine. Just go get some breakfast and check in on me. I should be okay by then." So I wolfed down some food and then went back to check on her. "Mom, how are you doing?" And she didn't reply to me. She was unconscious and still seizing. So I called 911. Crazy set of circumstances. The paramedics come in, they're blitzing me with all these questions, you know, trying to figure out exactly what happened. And then the question I remember the most was, "Does your mom use drugs?" "No, my mom doesn't use drugs." "Why would you ask me that question?" "Well, this looks like a drug overdose." And then they laughed. And for some reason that I still, like, thinking back on it, I don't know why, they wouldn't let me go with them in the ambulance. I didn't know what to do. You know, a 15-year-old just sort of struggling. So I went to school, and I was, you know, by the time I got to school, it was late. So I went into the office and she said, "And how come you're late?" And I started crying. So she went and she got she got my counselor, and my counselor sort of walked through what had happened. And he did something that I don't even know if he was supposed to do, but it was the right thing to do. He actually took me to the hospital with my mom in the hospital. She was continuing to seize, continuing to be unconscious. And it was very touch and go. The doctors were like literally they were asking me, are there any family members that need to come and say bye? Because we don't know if she's going to make it. And I was just not equipped to deal with this. And it 100% shook me. My mom recovered, but I kind of didn't. Why would my mom, who was this good, kind, generous person, out of the blue have this event that nearly kills her? And then you compound this on top of the fact that I come from an abusive family. Before my parents got divorced, my dad was extremely violent, very psychologically and physically abusive. It was very tenuous already. And this event pushed me over the edge and brought me to this place of suicidality where I didn't want anything to do with this thing called life because it seemed like there was nothing worthwhile in it. The summer before my 6th grade year, my mom had made a deal with herself and with some friends that no later than July 1st of that year, she was going to leave my dad. We lived in Ohio at the time, and the excuse that my mom gave for us leaving the house, because my dad was very domineering around who did what when. The excuse she gave is there was a family wedding in California. The day after the wedding, my mom filed divorce papers. 2 days later, my dad flew out from Ohio to California to basically try and threaten her into pulling the papers. She just said, Jerry, I need to have a different life than what I have right now. The life that I live with you isn't the best that I could have, and I deserve better. Us being together is not a good thing. It's not good for us, and it's not good for Chris. My parents, obviously in the divorce decree, there were guidelines around who has custody and when. So for the first 2 years after the divorce, so through 6th and 7th grade, we had this shipping me from one parent to the next. So over the course of 2 years, I lived with my mom for 6 months and lived with my dad for 6 months, and then that repeated. And then my dad just bailed. He decided, I guess it's best for Chris if I'm not around at all. So that would have put it at around 8th grade, 7th or 8th grade, where the shipping back and forth stopped. And then literally the next time I saw my dad was at my high school graduation. It was really painful for my dad to decide not to be a part of my life. Again, I sort of internalized that as my dad decided I'm not worth his time and that there is nothing redeemable in me. I got married really young, and my wife already had a 2-year-old. So it was sort of like instant family, just add ring. So I was sort of picking up jobs wherever I could, and my wife was picking up jobs wherever she could. And it always felt like there was more month than money. So that sort of stress, along with the stress of trying to figure out how to be a parent, I started to have the worthless thoughts pop back into my head. Things that sound like, you're no good, this is never going to get better, you can't measure up, you shouldn't be a father, you're a bad husband. There's this weird subculture in some Christian circles that I was a part of at the time that says if your mental health isn't in a good spot, the reason it's not in a good spot is because you're not being a good Christian. And so that pressure of not being a good Christian really added on and started to bury me. I'm not really ready to go talk to a counselor, but I'll at least go talk to my pastor. So I laid out for him over the course of about 10 minutes, and then I told him what I was struggling with now. And he said to me 5 words that I'll probably never forget. Everything that's happening to you is happening because you're not taking your spirituality seriously enough. So eventually we got to the point in the church we're at where things were toxic enough for me that we decided to leave that church. It took us a while to find a new home, but eventually we landed at a new church that was a much healthier environment. Sort of the first linchpin that happened related to that is when I heard the pastor say from the pulpit, hey guys, I'm taking Wellbutrin. I take a psychotherapeutic medication, and I'm glad that I do. It makes me a better husband, it makes me a better father, it makes me a better pastor. And if you need to be on those sort of meds as well, then do it. These are good things that God allowed to be out there. And what that really did, honestly, is it gave me permission to let go of that burden. And it gave me permission to begin to be honest with some of my close friends. So at the end of the day, over the course of the next few months, it actually solidified my friendships so that I have stronger friendships with the people that matter the most to me. In addition to having depression and suicidal ideations, I also have a seizure disorder. I bring that up because it's relevant for my first counselor. Kind of randomly picked a counselor because I had no idea. I've never done this before, so I just picked a counselor. Started going to her. Poor lady. She's like, "And what are you doing here today?" So she started giving me some coping mechanisms. She started to help me understand how to reframe cognitively some of these negative thoughts that I continue to have. And then I had one of my absent seizures in the middle of one of our sessions. And the first thing she says when she sees me move is, "What is happening to you? You didn't tell me this is what it was going to be like." So I tried to sort of walk her through it, and she just couldn't recover. I'm like, "So why don't you go get my wife, and we'll sort of talk through this a little bit more." I knew that there was going to be a possibility of me having additional seizures. And if that's how she was going to deal with them, she wasn't going to be a good fit for me. So I eventually found a new counselor, and I took it a little bit slower with this one, so it wasn't like 100 miles an hour. And then we started talking some about, the struggles that I was having with the faith aspect of my life. It is difficult to reconcile believing in an always good God when there's a lot of darkness in my life. She took that as permission to rail on Christianity for the next 25 minutes. And she encouraged me to throw the crutch away and to find the reality of life on my own terms. So then I ended up writing a letter to her sort of after that event, sort of detailing, "These are the things you said that were unprofessional, inappropriate, and uncalled for." And I sent it to her, and then I was done with counseling. So things came to a head around 2018. I was at home alone. My wife was working. My kids were at school. And these suicidal thoughts started railing at me. And then they shifted a little bit. They shifted to, there's medication you could take right now that would end it. And I couldn't, and I knew which meds, because in previous times where I'd felt suicidal, I'd had that thought, and I'd sort of done research around what meds I could take that would probably result in an overdose. I called my wife at work. I just had this thing, like, I need to tell my wife what's happening before I do it. So she's like, "Hey, how are you doing?" "Oh, I'm doing really bad, actually. I'm having suicidal thoughts. For some reason, I'm calling you. I guess to stop me. I don't even know why I'm calling." And she's like, "Chris, I'm slammed at work. I can't leave right now. We're already short-staffed. Let me make a couple phone calls." And she really marshaled the troops. So while we're still on the phone, I get another phone call from my buddy Kevin. Kevin's like, "Hey, same sort of conversation. Hey, how are you doing?" "Terrible. Contemplating taking pills to end my life right now." And he says, "Oh, dude, don't do that. You are such an important part of my life. Please don't end your life. Do you want me to come over?" "No, I don't want you to come over." And then I get another call from my buddy Joel. And this call is different. Joel is a chaplain, or was a chaplain at a mental health facility. So he's asking me questions like, "Do you have a plan? Do you have an intent to execute that plan? Do you think you're going to be okay if you're left by yourself?" And I answer those questions the way you would expect me to answer them. And then he says, "I'm 12 minutes away. I'm going to stay on the phone with you until I get there. And then we're going to check you into my mental health facility because you're a danger to yourself." So I pack the things that he tells me to pack, and then we go to his mental health facility. I think I was there for 6 days. They tweaked my meds quite a bit and connected me with a psychiatrist. When I was in the psych ward, it was almost a surreal experience, because some of the people that I was sharing that wing of the ward with were dual diagnosis people, meaning that they had an abuse situation and a mental health condition. And they referred to me as a normie. I'm like, "What is a normie? That's so strange. You're just a normal dude who had a bad day." And it was really eye-opening to me to see even how there were levels, even within the patients at the mental health facility, about how they viewed themselves. And I also learned a lot of humility while I was in there. There was a guy, I'll call him Eddie. He taught me so much about resilience that I just didn't know. He had been homeless for 3 years, had been struggling with addiction for 5 years, and was suicidal. He had been arrested and brought to the psych ward for a cleanup, to clean him up before he was going to serve his sentence. I remember him saying to me something like this: Chris, I've been battling all this stuff for 5+ years and my life is a wreck, but I'm convinced I'm going to make it this time. Something's different. I just feel it. I'm going to make it this time. I'm going to get through, and I'm going to get to the other side, and I'm going to be able to rebuild my life. And he taught me so much about resilience just in that moment. And that lesson, that conversation is something that's stuck with me and inspired me when I start to feel overcome or overwhelmed with the negative thoughts that still sometimes come. So it was one of the things that sort of caused me to pause, maybe step away from the pills a little bit more, because I realized that, hey, I'm still doing something positive. Even in my darkest moments, I was able to set aside the trauma and the frustration and the difficulties of my own life and really listen intently to the things that are happening with my friends. Just give them the ability to know they are being heard. What I was doing is I was saying, I hear you, I'm for you, and I'm with you. And those things I think were really helpful for my friends. So after I was released from the psych ward, there was family repair that had to happen. I had to explain to my kids and to my wife what happened and why. I made some commitments to them that it wouldn't happen again. But there was a lot of damage control that I had to do, a lot of communicating around. I wasn't looking to end my life because I'm unhappy with the life I have. I just had so much pain and I needed it to end, and I didn't know how else to do it. I think the biggest mistake I made when I came out of the psych ward the first time was that I thought I can just keep on keeping on. I've got my meds sort of adjusted. I don't need to do anything else. I can just ignore the fact that I have this lifelong problem with suicidality. That was a terrible mistake, something that had some significant ramifications for me. In August of 2020, I actually had a suicide attempt. It was 1 or 2 days after my youngest son's birthday. We were just chilling downstairs, kind of just talking about whatever. And then I had these suicidal thoughts sort of bombard me. So I quietly went upstairs. I typed out a goodbye letter to my family. About an hour later, my wife came upstairs. She thought I was just taking a nap. She came upstairs and found me sprawled on the ground and could clearly see that I had taken a bunch of meds. One of the most painful things that I've ever heard is she said to me when we talked through this, she said, and I had to decide in that moment if I cared. I was so angry because you had promised that you were never going to do this again. And that busted my heart up so much. Not in a way that, I didn't have any kind of negative emotion toward my wife because of that, because I get where she's coming from. Everything that she was feeling is legitimate. But she eventually, thankfully, decided, I can't just leave him. He's my husband. Then the next thing that she had to figure out was, how do I deal with this? So she was like, well, I really don't want to call 911 because then it's going to produce a lot of stress and anxiety and questions for the kids. So I'm going to see if I can just get him to the car on my own. My tiny wife tries to carry me downstairs, fails miserably because she's not a superwoman. And then she ends up calling 911, and I get admitted to a different psych ward. My overwhelming emotion was frustration. And the frustration specifically was this: Chris, you can't even kill yourself, right? And that's a ridiculous thought to have. And I stayed in that place for probably the first 2 days that I was in the psych ward. And then everything shifted for me in a moment, in a really remarkable way, honestly. I was sitting in the group room. We were watching some cinematic masterpiece like Rambo 17. I felt this quickening in my heart, like God wanted to communicate something to me. So I went into my room, and I just sat on the bed. And I heard God whisper to me clear as day, Chris, I still love you. And I was getting ready to engage in an argument. God didn't have any of that. Instead, he just repeated, Chris, I still love you. And the second time, that hit really different. It established just a tiny corner of hope in my heart. If God, the creator of the universe, who knows everything about me, looks at the disaster that I am 2 or 3 days after a suicide attempt and still sees something worth redeeming, maybe there's some reason for me to be investing in myself anyway. So that was the first step of sort of the recovery of my heart, the recovery of my hope. The next step came the next day. My pastor, the same pastor who said that he took Wellbutrin, came to visit me. So I remember going and talking to him. And we small talked for a little bit. How's the food? It's not very good. How are the people? I don't know. And then I saw his demeanor change. And he said, Chris, we need to talk. And I remember thinking to myself, oh no, here it comes. He's going to demolish me. But he didn't. Instead, with love brimming in his eyes, he looked at me and he said, Chris, we can't have this happen again. The church isn't the whole church without you. We need you to be complete, and God's not done writing your story. So in the same way that God, through that moment in the bedroom, had called me back to hope, my pastor called me back to community. And it shifted the entire way that I was interacting with people in the psych ward. Rather than being zombie Chris, I was engaged. I was trying to learn as much as I could learn because I realized that something had to shift for me, that I couldn't just keep doing the same thing. The biggest thing that I realized I needed to do was finish the process I had started with counseling. A counselor who was going to be okay with the fact that I might have a seizure. So during several intake interviews, I mentioned that and asked them, is that something that you'll be okay with? And then the next thing was I needed to have someone, based off that second counselor, I needed to have someone who was not going to be tearing down my faith. So once we sort of narrowed down those things, it came down to 2 different counselors. One of the counselors talked about on his webpage, I had missed this earlier, he talked about how he helps men achieve their God-given potential to find freedom from the darkness of depression. I've been to that place. I don't like that. I don't need that anymore. So then there was just one guy left. So I called Glenn. After a little bit of phone tag, we ended up connecting with each other. And I remember the first interaction that I had with him, I again laid out for him, so I have this seizure disorder. I'm probably going to zone out at some point during our conversation. Are you going to be okay with that? I understand what seizures look like. That sounds like it's a pretty mild seizure. As long as there's nothing I need to do, we'll be fine. And then I laid out, in brief, here's sort of my story, lifelong struggle with suicidality and depression. I have a lot of work I need to do on my history because I believe that my suicidality is sort of sourced in my bad past, the things that happened to me. Is that something you think you can help me with? And Glenn looked at me and said, Chris, I've walked this path with dozens of people. I don't want to pretend to understand what you're feeling. And I've walked this path with probably 50 people, helping them find stability. I'm confident that I can help you if you'll let me. I was seeing him weekly or bi-weekly after a while. He gave me so many tools that have helped me to know what to do when I feel like I'm starting to be piled on with those depressive, suicidal thoughts. He's given me questions that I can ask. Like one of the key things that he's given me is actually these questions that I can ask of the thoughts. And the first question you want to ask is this thought necessarily true? Most of the time, that question alone is going to be enough because it's going to be based off, the thought is going to be like, you're a terrible dad. Is that necessarily true? Well, no, there are moments I'm actually pretty good dad. Great. Let's move on then. But if it does pass that first test, then the next question I can ask is this a helpful thought? Does it do something worthwhile for me? The thoughts never got past that second question because they were always negative attacking thoughts. They were never helpful thoughts. They were never encouraging. I guess the best way to describe it is he helped me to slow down the moment and take control of it instead of being controlled by it. My life since August 2020, has taken like a 180. I still have those those mental health moments, but now I have the tools that I need to navigate those. And I'm in a place probably of better stability than I've been in I don't know how long. I feel really blessed. I think the number one thing I would say to someone who is feeling like they're in a really dark place and feeling like, oh gosh, I don't know if this is ever going to end, is that lean into resilience. Just trust that every season does come to an end. Seasons shift. And the other thing I would say, the best thing you can do is lean into your friends. And if you have faith, lean into your faith. Trying to get through dark seasons, challenging times on your own is almost impossible. But with the right support system in place, we can navigate just about anything.